It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays, well, they're for me to talk about monster movies. Last week, I talked about a movie that I first saw in Mystery Science Theater 3000, and this week, it's more of the same. If we trace back through the Monster Mondays episodes I've done, I've talked about Squirm, which was a killer worm movie that played so often on TBS during rain-delayed Braves games that there's a whole other level to the pop culture impact it has. With It Conquered the World, it's a Roger Corman movie, so it has lots of Venusian tendrils and lots of sci-fi pies. And now it's The Incredible Melting Man's turn. These three movies represent a whole lot of charm of what MST3K did for me. It's likely that It Conquered the World would have made its way to my eyeballs on its own. Like I said, Corman. It's real easy to see most of his movies. But these little, likely regional horror movies like Squirm and The Incredible Melting Man are so deeply buried since their initial theater, drive-in, or cable runs, it's not as easy to know about them. Enter MST3K, who taught us all to laugh at some silly movies and appreciate others. The Incredible Melting Man was released in 1977 and was directed by William Sachs, who himself is a very interesting character. He directed a handful of movies, mostly low budget and probably considered exploitation within the genres he'd worked with. Sachs considers himself a surrealist and was inspired by the works of Federico Fellini. Most of his movies will contain some sort of out there idea or subplot. And considering he makes American movies, and let's face it, America, we're not exactly the smartest bunch of film goers, his surrealist style was often messed with by producers. Aside from being a director, he was also known as a film doctor. He'd go in during post and recut the movie or go out and shoot some extra scenes and coverage, and bam, all of a sudden you had a new and often considered better movie that would emerge from that. He was given praise for his doctoring of the 1970 Peter Boyle satire called Joe, for bringing the title character of Joe to the forefront of the movie instead of being more of a casual observer. A couple more famous movies he doctored was Cannon Films' Exterminator 2 from 1984 and 1993's Leprechaun. And to hear more about Leprechaun, I invite you to come back to filmseizure.com during the month of October, where Jason and I will be killing ourselves slowly watching all 8 of those goddamn movies. However, I digress. Sachs was quite aware of the lane he found himself in as a filmmaker. He's quoted as saying about the post-production work on one of his earliest films, quote, "I was doing post-production on my first film in Rome. There were 3 cutting rooms in a row. I was in the middle one. Antonioni was on one side and Fellini on the other. I thought if I could just touch both walls at the same time, I might be able to get injected with some of their genius. Too bad my arms were too short." I appreciate your self-deprecating attitude, sir, but let's face it, to me, Galaxina is a goddamn masterpiece. So here's the gist of this movie. NASA has sent a trio of astronauts on a mission to Saturn. Now, naturally, they're not landing there. Let's not be silly. They're just hanging out around Saturn. Colonel Steve West is the head honcho of this mission, and he notes, and you hear this played often through the movie, that you haven't seen anything until you've seen the sun through the rings of Saturn. Just then, the sun has tremendous gas and belches radiation all the shitting way out to Saturn somehow, and kills West's co-pilots and splashes a bunch of radiation onto him. And suddenly, he's back on Earth and heavily bandaged. The doctor, who's overseeing West, calls his pal Ted Nelson.
Ted Nelson.
Ted Nelson.
Ted Nelson. Nelson, Nelson. 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 Nelson.
Another MST3K alum with Dr. Nelson as a character. How about that? West wakes up and decides he doesn't want none of this hospital crap no more, and he breaks out and realizes his head and his hands are gross and melty, and when he tears off his bandages around his head, he freaks out at what he sees and starts wrecking the hospital room. This poor nurse runs away from him and like through the glass door, like through that fucking glass door of the building. Anyway, he catches her and kills her and escapes, where he starts melting more and starting to kill pretty much everyone he comes across. And that's pretty much the entirety of the movie. West continues to melt. Dr. Ted Nelson chases him. West kills guys. Nelson tries to rein him in. Nelson basically believes West has gone nuts. For some reason, he also thinks that West has to consume human flesh in order to slow the melting process. I'd really like to know if there is some concrete scientific support for that, but whatever. There's another subplot about Dr. Nelson's wife being pregnant, and they've tried now 3 times to have a kid or something. Anyway, West keeps rampaging through the town before eventually coming to a head at a power plant. There, West kills the sheriff and nearly kills Nelson before saving him. However, a couple of armed security dudes shoot and kill Nelson by accident when he tries to protect West. West eventually slumps against the building, where the janitor finds him the next morning and scoops up his leftover goop that melted there on the concrete and throws him in the garbage. And just before the credits roll, we hear audio of another astronaut mission going to Saturn. So let's talk about my 3 things that I like about this movie. First up, this movie is pretty gross, really. This is thanks yet again to Rick Baker's awesomely goopy melting man special effects. The dude isn't just losing his skin or leaving gross piles of goop wherever he goes or emitting radiation all over the joint. He's literally full of creamy goodness of a Cadbury egg mixed with that syrup that comes with strawberries or cherries. It's actually quite disgusting and really damn good. Next, there is 0 time wasted in this movie. It's fast-paced and fun because it just tosses these wild horror and sci-fi ideas against the wall and doesn't even look to see if they stick. I mean, he's got to eat flesh to stop melting? I mean, well, that doesn't really work out for him. He eats a fisherman and his ear still melts off his fucking face. I mean, how he even got to his melty state is also totally preposterous. He was all the way out by fucking Saturn. The sun burped some crazy radiation his way, like all the way out to Saturn, and then he just suddenly wakes up on Earth. How did he get back? How did he survive? Did he radio back saying he's all radioactive and melty now? How did any of this work? I love movies with questions like this that pretty much don't bother to answer a single goddamn one of them. Sure, there are movies that have those frustrating questions, but man, this movie is one of those that decides that none of that is important and you're just going to like it. Also, I positively love the fact that West is unceremoniously just melted on the ground and gets scooped up and tossed in the garbage at the end. Thirdly, this movie has a very 70s downbeat tone. Ted Nelson is set up to be a hero who knows more about what's going on with West than anyone else, but he gets shot in the face when a frenzied, confused security guard just can't keep from pulling his trigger. West seemingly would be a hero himself after returning from a mission to Saturn, just melts with no one knowing anything about what happened to him. More people going to Saturn to probably be turned into monsters. I mean, it's nuts. And on top of that, there is a scene in which literal kids are smoking cigarettes because they apparently were bored that day. They trick a little girl into going someplace alone, and she gets freaked out by the melting man. When she runs by screaming, one kid is reading a Playboy, and they're both just laughing at her. I mean, that's bonkers shit, man. I mean, there's a scene in which a guy is taking pictures of a girl, and he wants her to take off her top, and she won't. So he forces it off of her and takes pictures of her boobs while she's trying to punch and slap him. I mean, there's this old couple who are Ted Nelson's in-laws, and it's played like a total joke with jokey music and how they bicker back and forth like a couple who've been married for decades. Also, I positively love the fact that Wes just unceremoniously melts on the ground and gets scooped up and tossed into the garbage. I can't say that enough. That's just rich. It doesn't even look like the janitor even understands that it's a person. He just probably thinks a drunk had a hell of a night and barfed all over the place. It's totally nuts in a way that presents this horror and sci-fi idea with these crazy bonker scenes of smoking kids, lecherous photographers, silly old people, and the hero being pretty useless. But there's a reason for that. Remember I said that Sachs is a surrealist, right? And that producers often messed around with his vision, right? Well, he's so influenced by surreal ideas that this movie was shot and written to be a surrealistic comedy with lots of absurd moments. The producers made sure to get rid of all of those elements. This movie, with a guy melting into a goopy mess and killing people after coming home from space, yeah, that seems like real comedy to me. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon on filmseizure.com. And be sure to check out new posts on my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday morning.